Hello, everyone. This is Ben Marchman with NatureLink, and I'm the host of the FireKeepers Global Summit, in which we'll gather for powerful conversations with cutting-edge experts and thought leaders who will guide you to connect to your truest self and activate your natural gifts. This event is designed to reinstate the importance of carrying our soul-directed vision back into our communities so that ourselves and our communities will flourish. Here you're invited to learn how to seek the guidance of your inner voice so you can truly understand what it means to live life with purpose. I'm very excited today to be talking with Javan Bernakevitch. He is an international land designer, consultant, speaker, facilitator, and educator with All Points Design in Canada. Since 2009, he's worked with over 1,500 students and clients, where he helps them clarify their values, direction, and decision-making, as well as helping to work with limiting beliefs, behaviors, and patterns, and even diagnosing, designing, and creating landscapes and businesses and lives that help people get better year after year and the land. Two great quotes from clients that Javan has worked with before. First one is, I call him a life mechanic. I love the life mechanic piece. I came to him with problems, and together we worked them out, and I left with more positive change than I've ever thought possible. It was like looking in my car's side mirror and reading, change is closer than it appears. Another client says that Javan is a kind of like a Sherpa. You help us get from point A to point B. You help us plot our course, take our baggage for a while, but you give it all back eventually with the recommendation of what we don't need to hold onto anymore. You have tools to help us acclimate to higher levels of success. You leave us better than we were before. They're two awesome quotes that describe Javan a little bit. And his topic today is, if you don't design your life, someone else will. So welcome.
Thanks so much, Ben.
I'm excited to discuss some things with you today in your life.
Yeah, looking forward to it as well. Thanks for putting this on.
Yeah. So kind of a common first question I ask most of the speakers is just, how did you get to be at this point in your life? What's your life history so far?
Well, I'm glad we have 4 days because I'm excited to tell you all about my life. My experience with this work has been, as most people, I think it's a bit of a meander and it's a bit of a course. I grew up and was born and raised in Calgary, Alberta, and was quite keen on being out in nature as a Boy Scout and going out camping, and backcountry camping and wilderness skills were always very close to my heart. And as I grew up and started to interact more with my own natural gifts and my own loves, I was really keen on broadcasting and communication and speaking, and thought that I would go into radio broadcasting, and found that the type of radio broadcasting that was available, sort of the top rock DJ, was not what I was looking for. So pulled back and ended up getting really involved in environmental education. Really enjoyed that hit a lot of buttons and really met a lot of my needs. But I still wanted to see more change. And so I was educating with the Riverwatch company out of Edmonton, Alberta, taking kids down the North Saskatchewan River, doing biological testing, dissolved oxygen in water, things to help them understand that even though they lived in a city that had this incredible ecology all around them at all times. And I found that I wasn't having the change or the impact that I really wanted. And so one day I decided it was time to kind of go back to where I started from, which was construction with my father. I started about when I was 13 years old. And folks who have worked with their parents know that it's not quite slave labor, but it's real close. And so I worked with him in residential and commercial construction for 10 years. And I thought maybe that's what we need, because I had this need or this want to try and right some of the issues that I saw wrong in the world. And one of them was, as we were interacting with our environment, the environment that supports us and keeps us alive, we weren't doing that great of a job. So I thought, well, what if I could help change the understanding about building? What if we could build with different materials that after we were finished, we could put back into the landscape? So I went to go and learn about natural building at Eco Village on Vancouver Island. And after the course, which was fantastic, and I learned a ton, somebody said, hey, do you want to take a permaculture design course? Well, I'd heard about permaculture back in Edmonton when a friend of the houses, because we had multiple people in the house, friend of the houses said, hey, I want to stay for the weekend. And 3 months later, we had to ask them to leave. But they were really into permaculture. So when somebody said, hey, do you want to take a course in permaculture? I thought, I don't need a course in mooching. Like, I'm good. I know how to do that a little bit. I try not to. And they said, well, it's 50% off. And if folks don't know about Alberta, where I was born, Alberta is kind of like the product of a one-night stand between Texas and Montana, bigger, better buck and lone rugged woodsman and always looking for a deal. So 50% off sounded pretty cool to me. So I took the course, and it was at the end of the first day that the instructor was speaking about the prime directive of permaculture, which is to take responsibility for yourself and for that of your children. And the original 3 ethics, which is to take care of the earth, to take care of the people, because as you take a look at the earth is where everything comes from. It's where all of our capitals come from. The people help connect with and create that capital. And then to set limits to consumption and redistribute that surplus. And as we got into David Holmgren's, the second founder of permaculture's 12 principles, I just thought this is the closest thing to a life ethic I could imagine. I tried to have been involved with a number of religions and didn't find it tick really well. And so, shaking as I raised my hand, the instructor said, yeah. And I said, this is amazing. These are guidelines for living without all of the, all of these people are good except for these people or those people. This is really about allowing personal directive and narrative to take charge. And so for the next 5 years, I jumped in head to hands and feet, as my Cuban friends and colleagues like to say. Worked on building regenerative living landscapes the world over in Kenya, Uganda, Cuba, Canada, America, and did a lot of remote consultations the world over. And then about 5 years ago, I came upon some really interesting tools that were helping folks who worked with landscapes create incredible lives. And they were tools around decision making. There were tools around natural gifts. There were tools around understanding the personal resistance we feel on a day-to-day basis, and then addressing those personal resistance to be able to move towards the values and the objectives that you're interested in. And so I started to offer life design for my land-based or land-interested clients, those who were ecologically minded or connected. And 6 years later, I've been doing an incredible amount of work with folks clarifying their beliefs and their values, so that way they can have a ruthless clarity of vision and really make better decisions. Management has been one of our major issues in human society. And once you clarify the fact that people have specific values and visions and you work towards those, you end up becoming inoculated against society's push for always having the next thing to buy or purchase. And it's been fantastic because at the same time, I'm still designing landscapes. I just finished a pre-purchase property assessment for over 3,000 acres, still consulting with good friends and colleagues that are working in Africa and otherwise. And just recently kind of jumped into the documentary filmmaking game with a film called Facing Fire, Building Resiliency to Wildfire. If you want to take a look at it, you can go to facingfirefilm.com. And that whole conversation came up out of a lot of my loves, which is understanding the why of things, the root cause. How did we get here? Where are we going? And as I was experiencing the wildfire situations of Western Canada, where I live, which has a lot of the similar roots and similar conversations all along Western North America, I really wanted to understand how we got here, what can we do about it, and where can we go from here? So I made this 22-minute film that expounded a lot of the lessons I had learned in land design and life design, and found a lot of incredible conversations there and just a love of storytelling. The short of it, Ben.
Yeah. And I love how you summarize all that, because you've done so much. And but to find that niche in land design and system seeking permaculture, and then comparing that and fusing that in with life design, I think is a really neat niche on how you pull your vision and your gifts back to your community. And I'm sure permaculture actually has been mentioned maybe by one or two of our other speakers, but we never expounded on actually what permaculture is. And the other speakers didn't. We didn't go down that path. And like really briefly, could you? And that can be really hard to describe what permaculture is very briefly, but we wanted to attempt that. Like, if you just want to talk about the principles and ethics and like what
Sure.
it is. And it's a very brief, because some of our viewers and listeners might not know, but I'm assuming many of them do. But just in case, some of them might not know.
Yeah, I'd love to. So permaculture was the brainchild of two men, Bill Mollison and David Holmgren, who were teacher and student respectively at the end of the 70s into the 80s. And Permaculture 1 was David Holmgren's thesis. And it was a culmination of what these two men had considered to be living practices and design practices about how to live with the ecology and with the people and with everything that we've created in human society for the long term. How can we stay on the planet for as long as possible? So the portmanteau of permanent agriculture became permaculture. So how can we have agriculture that doesn't degrade landscapes, that actually leaves us with more than there was before? Which leads us into one of the first lessons or the first gifts I want to give in this chat, which is there's an energy audit idea where we've got regenerative, generative, and degenerative. And regenerative is more than we had before. And a lot of ecological systems do this naturally. When we take a look at trees and deer, when deer browse on trees, when they nibble on trees, there tends to be a hormone response, and the tree goes, oh, we've lost some leaves, we need to grow more. And so there's actually more with use. And so regenerative, more than there was before, is that top level conversation that we're always shooting for, which permaculture is based around. Generative, another word for generative is sustainable. And I think the conversation about a sustainable society is finally starting to quiet down, which is great, because I don't want to sustain this society. This society on a number of levels doesn't leave me regenerative. So why would I want to keep it going? A friend of mine always has a nice joke. If I asked you about your relationship with your partner and I said, how is it? And you said, it's sustainable. Should I be worried? Because we're not looking for sustainable. We're looking to have more love, more life, more connection, more freedom in our lives. And then finally, there's degenerative, which is less than there was before. So there's a number of processes and conversations and fuel types that are degenerative. When we take a look at petroleum, we tend to end up with less than we had before. We have this highly concentrated form of energy that when applied has 80 hours of work for every liter of petroleum, but afterwards the pollution that comes off of it, the excess waste in terms of heat and pollutants, is a degenerative conversation in the totality of how we use that type of fuel. So permaculture aimed to take a look at any situation, any system, be it agricultural system, be it a land-based system, be it a municipal system. And they took a lot of ideas from a lot of other people, like Masanobu Fukuoka, the no-till orchardist and gardener out of Japan, P.A. Yeomans, the keyline innovator out of Australia, and many, many others, and collate them into an idea to bring back the idea of taboos, that there are things we should and should not do. Because as we've moved into a very independent society, a very liberty-based society, we lose sight that there are some things that if we hold collectively as traits, as tools, as rules, as taboos, we actually go really far as a culture. And we don't forget that this is a wonderful spaceship hurtling through space with a bunch of talking monkeys on it. And chances are that whatever we do on one side of the planet will affect somebody else. As we're recording this, it's just after the Australian bushfires of 2020. And the emissions from those fires are going to completely do a rotation around the earth and come all the way back. This is a closed globe. So some of the permaculture principles and practices and that they put together were based on this sort of foundational pyramid. And so you can think of at the the inverted pyramid at the bottom, you have this prime directive to take care of ourselves and to take responsibility for ourselves and for our children. So it really brought back a directive of take care of your needs, take care of your situation, take care of your family, which spectacularly culminated in one of Bill Mollison's most famous quote, which is all the world's problems can be solved in the garden, with Jeff Lawton, which is one of his major students and probably one of the biggest proponents of permaculture these days, really took to heart. And to really get your garden in order at the personal level, to make sure that you are personally taken care of before you start, stepping out and moving on other areas. That then led to the 3 permaculture principles, which originally were care of the earth, because that's where the asset comes from. That's where all of the great wealth and connection that we have in this world exists. Then to take care of each other, which was great that they put that right at the bottom floor. Because as you take a look at how we connect with the value and the resources and the connection that comes off of our incredible ecology, it's moderated through people. Bill tried to go and live in the bush, I think, as a lot of people dream of or try doing, and found that it was completely unattainable. There's a reason why we were evolved to be a herd animal, and we're still a herd animal. Single humans are as frightening as single chickens. It's a scary bunch out there when you don't have connection and connectivity. We do have a great need of love and connection, and we forget that. And then last but not least, and this principle, this final ethic, has changed as society changes with it. But originally it was to set limits to consumption and redistribute surplus. To know and to prune, and I talk a lot about this in podcasts and videos and conversations with clients, to always be thinking about pruning the excess. We are curated. We are truly curated as human beings when we don't focus upon the things that are to be added, but when we focus on the things that are to be subtracted, when we realize what we can do without, to really get to the core of the issue, to really understand who we are as individuals. It's all about that piece of getting down to just the specifics and to focus on those pieces. And so that setting limits to consumption is one of those pieces. And then redistributing surplus. So cycling in nature is really important. Cycling in ecology is essential. That's what ecological webs are about. And so when there is surplus, to then feed it back into the people and feed it back into the planet. And after 40 years of being out in the wild as things happen, and permaculture is in its 40s now, it's played with a lot of different people. It's grown to the point to where most people think of the portmanteau, that contraction word of permaculture, as actually being permanent culture. How do we stay on the planet as people as long as possible? There's lots of great definitions out there about permaculture. There's lots of people out there doing great work with permaculture. There's a lot of people out there that maybe are a bit misguided or a bit fanatical when they go into permaculture. And so for anybody who's interested in looking into it, I would recommend caution, as in all things. Make sure that you take a very good sampling of all that you see out there, because there's some amazing practitioners and people and folks who are doing incredible work. And it's always important to take a look at those stunning examples and to really base your ideas upon a good sampling of information. But permaculture has been, for me, an amazing tool in my toolbox, which I've used in both land and life design. And one of the major ways that I've used it in life design is to understand that we are indeed ecology. I think everyone comes back to that wonderful song, "We paved paradise and put up a parking lot." But we do that with ourselves. And the more that I looked into ideas of water capture, there's these points of inflection in the landscape where if you observe a landscape long enough, you can see where the water naturally is stopping and slowing, which usually means that's where there's clay and soil. And that usually means where we can hold landscape high up in, where we hold water high up in the landscape. My dyslexia is showing now. And what I found is that was the same thing for people, that there were spots and places in people's lives where the life energy, that water of life, just naturally fell. Places where people were just exceptional at what they did. And in allowing my clients and allowing the farmers I worked with to identify those natural gifts and to explore them and see them, we were then able to double down on those incredible moments, those intersections of where we take the most amount of output for the least amount of input. And as I got more into this and playing with permaculture and moving it in, I really did realize that it was a tool. When we bring a carpenter in to do some work for us, we're not referring to him as a hammerist, even though he uses a hammer, or a screwdriverist because he uses a screwdriver. And I think there's been a big push in land design or life design or whatever we do as humans to continually come down to a tool. And I call that person that tool. When really what we want is we want craftspeople. We want people who walk into a situation, really take good diagnosis of a situation, which permaculture has a great ability to do, because 80% of the value of any practitioner you ever work with is in the diagnosis. Ben, you know this well, being in a country that has a very interesting healthcare situation. You get diagnosed well, you can get treatment from anywhere. You know, there's cities that I've learned of in Mexico that are just pure treatment towns that people come in for vacation plus treatment because it's cheaper than getting treatment in your country. And that diagnosis is so important. We can spend years chasing our tail if we don't get diagnosis right. And so permaculture and the other tools I use really help with that diagnosis to have that permanent culture ongoing.
Yeah, yeah. And yeah, thanks for summarizing that. Like you were saying earlier, like this could be a subject you can talk for a whole week about, and still people would ask, "What? So what is it?" It is, and like I love how you phrased in the principles and the ethics. That was really well done in a brief way. It just reminds me too, like when I was doing like sustainable. At the time, I was actually an ecologist. I think I've told you this story, like habitat ecology restoration work, and I was working a lot with farmers and agricultural systems. And at the time, I actually hadn't heard of permaculture. This was like over a decade ago. And it's just a funny story that can relate to how you're pulling in the life design piece. And I was trying to explain, you know, my ethics on my approach and why we were doing this with their farm. And then eventually I found out how permaculture works. I'm like, oh, I'm pretty much just doing permaculture. And it like, because the ethics were aligned with that. And so then I started like just using it, but not using the word here and there, but it's still like in my own little ecologist hat. And I remember talking to like a woman, and I was like, yeah, but this is like a more of a permaculture design than one of our just typical habitat restoration designs. And she's like, oh, so does that have to do with like hair permaculture? And I was just, she had a lot of hair. She was like Dolly Parton hair. And I always just relate to that story, saying like, yeah, just you got to watch how you use that word, because some people take it any direction. I was just kind of like not really taken aback, but it was just kind of like, how in the world did she get hair out of this whole conversation? Perm, you know, like permed hair.
Yeah.
That's what she was valuing. You know, she was really into her hair. And so, yeah, kind of the next question, I guess, if you want to go in that direction, was seeing that, you know, permaculture and life design and land design with you, and how you fuse those together, like really drives your work and your values, your ethics. And before we go into the other big questions, I want to see if you want to expound a little bit on how your application, your concept of life design, and how you apply that with your clients, but also your work and life.
Sure. Yeah. So one of the things that I found out really early on, this was back when I was just designing land, and had completely had ignored the fact that land has to be managed by people. And I think a fair number of the folks that I've met that work in land design do that. They forget that this conversation is so intrinsically tied to people. We are ecology. This is this idea that has permeated into me over the last couple of years. We keep forgetting that the laws of nature apply to us, that on both the potentially frustrating, but also the potentially incredible aspect. We can take a look at the book of nature, we can read the book of nature, and we can understand things about ourselves that we may not have understood before. So as I was interacting with a lot of these clients, and as they were calling me, I found that while I could go in and I could do some land design work, I would probably end up doing the design work and then having the system fail because of the people and where they were at. So I had a couple call me up a couple years ago. They had a dairy And they said, we really want you to come in. We've heard you talk before. We've heard you talk about on the podcast and everything, and we think you could help us. I said, great, let's chat. So we had this conversation where they told me about the dairy. They told me about the issues. They wanted me to come and do a business audit and a redesign by both a financial and potentially a physical situation. But as they were talking, I kept on picking up on this friction between the two of them and going on and going on. And so I asked a few questions about it, in a very general way, like, what's it like working together on the farm? And it was like I had dropped a match into a powder keg, because all of that backlog, all those things that they were holding back to be polite on this phone call came out. And I said, it's ingenuous of me to take money from you to take a look at your business. And when I think that there's something underlying here, it's kind of like me going in to lay down incredible floors in a burning building, and taking money for it. It's unethical. However, I think I can help you with this interpersonal conversation. It's something I've dealt with quite a bit in my background. I dealt with and worked through a pretty chronic and severe depression. Had built up a number of tools and practices, had done quite a bit of facilitation for over 10 years, and really thought, perhaps I could help you because of some of these decision-making tools and whatnot. And I said, I'm about to leave for 10 days. I've got this silent Vipassana meditation retreat, and I can help you in about 14 days. And they said, great, awesome. Sounds good. We'll get back to you. And they got back to me and they said, if we don't talk to you soon, we fear the house will be burnt down. And I thought, okay, well, I've got tomorrow morning before I go. And so we had an hour and a half conversation, and I used a tool which I use with a lot of clients. And it's another lesson, another gift I want to pass on, which is when we take a look at problems in life, we tend just to take a look at them and walk away or ignore them. And one of their major problems was they were not communicating positively with each other. They were communicating in such a way that they weren't listening to each other, that they weren't being careful about the words that they were saying to each other. And so when we get a sense of the problem, then what we ask is, what's the potential of that? Where do you want to get with that problem? What would be the ideal, amazing place to be? If this is the Isle of Woe, what's the Isle of Wow? And they said, well, we'd like to speak to each other well. We'd like to we'd like to listen more than we speak. They had all these things. So we shortened it down to a simple statement that had the essence that if your thoughts walk down the stairs of your mind and they're dressed in such a way to go out and actively do harm, or if they come down with malintent, you got to march them right back up the stairs. Ask them to change, and they're not going out your mouth unless they do. And I said, can you do that? And she said yes, and he said yes. And I said, great, that's the only thing you are to do this week. That is the modus operandi. That is the simple marching orders you have, is that as you are speaking, you hold to this value. And if you can't speak that way, you say, I can't speak to you right now. I need to take a break. And you go for a walk, you go for a bath, you do whatever it is that calms you down. Those are your referee rules. Can you do that? Yes. Can you do that? Yes. And one of them said, well, can you give us a book to read? And I said, have you guys read books before and argued over the meaning? And they both like, oh yeah. I was like, no, I'm not giving you a book. I'm just putting gasoline on this fire. You both have your marching orders. Go off. Be good to each other. Come on. Even if this doesn't work out, you need to start to practice and build a conversation that leaves you in a better place than when you started. So building skills and practices instead of always having a goal. So I go off, I sit silently for 10 days, try not to think about them. I think about them nonstop. So terrible idea for anybody who's listening. Good lesson. My error is your success. We all learn by mistakes. They just don't have to be ours. They can be others. When I get out, there's a little email waiting for me and it says, you lit a candle for us. I don't know why that worked, but it did. And here's a really interesting point that I want to make and gets to the heart of your question of, how does this go back and forth? If we do not deal with the personal resistance that we either come into this world with genetically, so past traumas, genetic trauma, epigenetics, if we don't deal with that, that's a problem. If we don't deal with the trauma or the frustrations or the personal resistance we picked up in our lifetime, so things that happen to us while we're alive, that's a problem. And I think your audience, I don't think I necessarily have to preface this as I usually do when I'm talking with farmers. And if we don't deal with the essence, some of the challenges or the frustrations we came into this world as a being, as a spirit, as some soul DNA, we have a problem. So there's three major areas that we have to focus on. And these folks finally decided to take a little bit of direction, and it's not a lot. Let's face it. All I said is, let's take your problem, let's take the potential, and that potential now becomes a value. And you now pass through every decision of communication through that value. It's a filter. If it doesn't pass through that filter, you don't do it, which is the crux of all of the values and visioning work I do and the decision-making work I do, is really to create a set of values that become a filter for any situation that comes towards you. So that way you can filter out the things that do not become your values. And you can also become inoculated against your own personal biases and societal biases, which have a lot to do with goals and getting things, which is such a terrible treadmill to be on, but it's great for the economy. So it's pretty easy to understand how that comes to bear. So I worked with those folks for a couple of months, help them set up good processes, good practices with each other. And they were definitely in a better place than when I connected with them. And the crux between land and life is that they're one and the same. If we don't take care and deal with the personal resistance we're born with, if we don't have a good way to make decisions, if we don't know our natural gifts, and if we don't focus on building better business for the 21st century than the 20th century using principles instead of recipes, we're going to be in poor shape. The world is actively changing with us and around us all the time. And while there are some core tenets, I think, for society that have been true since we finally had the cognitive revolution 70,000 years ago, there's lots of things that are changing, and we have to guard our time and we have to guard our attention more than anything else. And so much of that comes down to really prioritizing your life, knowing what your values are, and then making decisions based upon that. And if it's that you have a farm, or if it's you live in an urban setting, nothing changes. You're still a Homo sapien. You still have all the same frustrations and issues and mental, biological programming of both the biology that we have and otherwise. It affects both of us. And the last example I'll give is there's this really interesting conversation in neurology where we have these cells called the glial cells, Glial. And those glial cells are the orchestrators. We're learning more about them every day. And what I'm about to say is not the end of what we know about them, but probably just the beginning, really close to the beginning. The glial cells, when we go to sleep at night, they take a look at the thoughts we thunk, and they help and they sort of repair and buff and maintain the synapses of the thoughts that were fired with great frequency. And this harkens back to the time when we had a lot of predation upon us. And it's a pretty good system, right? Like if you make it through a day, whatever the thoughts that you were thinking in that day are good thoughts because you're still alive. And so the brain goes about being like, okay, well, let's polish those up and maintain them and put, spray them with WD-40, put some duct tape where we need to, and they're good. And the thoughts that didn't get used were put in disrepair and eventually would become the base matter, the raw material for new synapses and new firings. Now, fast forward 70,000 years to our current society, it's not the same. The biological hardware that we developed doesn't exactly work in our current situation. We can think a lot of thoughts in the day, and they may not actually support life. So we have to be very aware of our thoughts. We have to increase our awareness, and we have to have processes and tools which we can analyze, become aware of our thoughts, create tools and techniques, and learn them so that way we can augment those thoughts and practices and beliefs, and then start to integrate that, which is lifelong training, right? All of this is getting with a good idea and starting to train, because if it was just about information, we'd all be millionaires and have six-pack abs, but that's not life. All of this is about the work. It is about training. It is about realizing that we are hyperplastic beings in terms of we have a lot of flexibility. We can train ourselves better. We have a lot of plasticity to us. And by doing that and by understanding that, we can actively design our lives, because when we live in a corporate capitalistic society, if you don't design your life, somebody will design it for you, because you are actively being farmed in some way, shape, or form. We started farming, depending on what archaeological records you're looking at, anywhere between 10 and 16,000 years ago. And we've been farming people ever since. And it's really important to realize that the moment we're born, like all of those issues that we might be born with, we're also born with a lot of beliefs. And those beliefs come from parents, they come from genetics. We're just starting to understand that. And they also come from society at large. And most of the beliefs that I've been given from society, as I've looked into them and spent a lot of time analyzing them, they don't work for me. They're not a good fit for me. And that whole idea of, if you don't design your life, it'll be designed for you, and every single aspect of your life. So if you haven't thought about your finances, chances are you've taken somebody else's belief and they don't fit you accurately. They're not a good fit. And that idea of a good fit is paramount to life design and land design. Because if you take a look at the three circles of the land's potential, the client's wants, desires, and potential, and then the regulations, which is really important. I think a lot of people in permaculture get excited about what you could do, come onto a piece of land and being like, let's put ponds everywhere, and let's put this certain type of swale, which is a type of water harvesting earthwork. They forget that context is king, queen, it's everything. And so by realizing that our life is designed for us, it really creates an opening, an opportunity for us to take a look at almost anything within our lives and actively redesign it, because it's always a good time to redesign our lives. Hey, Ben, you're muted. I do like your hands moving back and forth, and I'm open to a puppet show. So if you want to.
My computer did that one call too. I clicked mute and then I clicked it again, and sometimes when it double clicks, it switches back. Sorry about that. There's some background noise, so I had myself muted for a little bit. So when it defer to your call, yeah, thanks for summarizing that in your own unique way. That was beautiful, and so many good points there. I like how you kind of move that into like that conversation, the story, and it moved back out into life design. That was really really neat. And and it's coming from a life coach point of view. I could probably help you expound on that for a lot, for a long rabbit hole. But I know we don't want to go too far over time. Yeah, and it kind of led me into another question. How you pull nature and like permaculture into like the person's life design themselves. What I think is so neat is like finances. A lot of people, like you're saying, forget about the finances piece, and like at the very end there we touch base on that, and the finances and like all these other things that we think we're doing ourselves, but like it's been designed over time. And in our programs I see a lot of the post-secondary trauma and how that's released. And a lot of us don't know, like the whole concept of this summit, you need that community to release to, but as well as the land, and you can't hold that in yourself. And like that story you told was just really beautiful, how you kind of like just asked that one question and it kind of just opened up that whole slew, because people need to release it in a certain way, and it's just really special how you did that. I think that's really cool. Yeah, so I guess one of the last questions here is, you kind of mentioned about change you're seeing with clients and yourself. And so that was kind of one of the last questions, like what's been the biggest change you've seen in this work? But I kind of want to change that into like, what's been the biggest change that you see your work doing in the communities that you're working in?
Wow. Yeah, there's this amazing saying from the Vedas, which is, which has been simplified to well begun is half done. And you have to think that everything begins in our bodies, gets usually filters, at least today, in our minds, and then becomes action in some way, shape, or form. And the biggest change I've seen in clients comes when they take the principles, the lessons, the practices that nature offers, and they embody them. Because it's like when you are walking and moving with a group of people, or if you are a bird moving with a murmur, you're moving with the energy that's around you. You're moving with the hand you're dealt instead of moving against it. And I think a lot of folks like to move against the hand they're dealt. I work with this great assessment called the Natural Gifts Assessment. It's a very quick but very deep scan of somebody about the gifts that we're currently expressing. We're born with lots of gifts, and time and situation and all those things we were talking about, they manifest certain ones. I think that's what's interesting about typologies, be they, astrological typologies or business typologies, Myers-Briggs, Enneagram. They give us a sense about what those gifts are. I'm working with a client right now who I've worked with for about 3 years. And as we went through a lot of the limiting belief work, the behaviors, the patterning, did a lot of interactions and conversations with the number of tools I use. Primarily these days, I'm using a lot of voice dialogue created by Hal and Sidgerstone. They were able to take a look at the parts of them, which is another little gift I want to give before we leave here, the parts of them that were believing certain things. And our society really exalts the I, the individual, to the detriment of ourselves. And once we start, whenever we're having a reaction, whenever we are either elated or not elated, frustrated, when we can stop and go, a part of me is frustrated, a part of me got angry there, a part of me is super excited. We give space in the center, we give space for awareness to then start to hold that multitude of who we are. And this individual in particular, they were able to take a part of them that was incredibly rage-filled and would go blinding red and just burn bridges left, right, and center and take down the town. And, there wasn't a lot left when that rage came out. And get to a point to where as the individual in a center of awareness, they were able to interact with it really well, which then brought them back to me to say, I really want to take a look at what my gifts are, because I feel like I've been playing another person's life for my entire life. And that's one of the other big parts that I've seen in success, is that when we finally realize that we change, what a simple idea, we change because we go throughout time. And Bill Mollison said this, that permaculturalists were time scouts because we actively looked at that wonderful dimension of time. People forget that. They tend to think that they're still 18 or they're still 5 or they're still the thing they thought when they were 30 or 80 or 50. I've worked with people of all ages. And once you realize that you are not that thing anymore, you are actively changing and growing, and what's true today is what's true today. You can never step in the same river twice, because the river is always moving and changing. Then you can have an incredible opportunity. You're eligible for incredible change. And that was my experience with this client, is that now that they have gone through that process, we're now working through their natural gifts, and we're doing a lot of business work to help them become hyper effective in their new line of work, which is interpersonal work, interpersonal dynamic work when it comes to trauma. You can just see them come alive. And I know her husband quite well. And he reaches out quite a bit and he goes, I can't believe the change in her. It's just so incredible. And the change in me, because we work together as well. So the change that I see more often than not is with individuals understanding that their ecology, understanding that they can change, understanding that they are actively, they have an active plasticity to them that when tapped into just grows with use. As so many things do, our muscles grow with use, right? There is that inroading process. I'm thinking of another client recently that I worked with, two farmers, a couple farming couple, and they were actively really frustrated with their current situation of where they were living and where they were farming. And they had reached out to me separately before they actually got together, which was interesting. And I worked with both of them. They'd come together and then they'd reach back out and they said, hey, we really want to clarify our values and vision for our partnership as a couple. And the times I do this with couples, it's one of the most beautiful moments, because at the end I get a lot of, we're finally on the same page, literally. When we take a look at what's important to us in our relationship, we're on the same page, and we have this sober second thought, this piece of us that is externalized that we can both come back to and we can make decisions off of. And it removes about 50 to 80% of the arguments that couples have, because they're both on the same page. That was a couple of years ago. And recently they came back and they said, listen, we really want to engage you again because we have this decision we want to talk about, which is we're really unhappy in the place we're at in farming. And I said, great, let's talk about it. And so we took about 6 months, and we moved through this great process of evaluating the decision to stay with their values. And then as we were moving through it, we said, great, what would it take to stay? So we had built an entire proposal about what would be good for them to stay. And there's this idea of thesis and antithesis. And we think about this a lot. I think we're raised to think in binary terms, and there's nothing binary about life. And once we can hold those two opposites, the thesis and the antithesis, these are our values, this is what we don't want. At the center in this triangle, we get synthesis. We get a third idea. And once we get a third idea, we can get a fourth and a fifth and a sixth. It opens up this incredible branching tree. It's the seed that becomes this new idea that just generates and branches and has all these conversations. And once we held that idea of this new proposal, we then came to an amazing discovery, which was they would really like to be independent farmers within the structure of this non-for-profit and sell directly to them, which solved almost all of their problems. And as usual, it was a very elegant solution. It was a very specific solution. So I would say the biggest change that I see in folks is further autonomy, further mastery, and a sense that the things that they had been held back with, the personal resistance, the beliefs of their parents, the beliefs of their ancestors, a challenging that's respectful, a challenging of going, does that actually make sense? Does that actually apply to me today? Or, as I think a lot of political scholars have realized, that some of the laws and some of the iterations of the societal values we hold were contextually based in time, and that as we go into the future, they need to augment and change to understand it. So too do our beliefs and our behaviors and our patterns. And once that's there, you save an incredible amount of time and money. The last client I'll end with here was a client whom had the ability to purchase back the original farm plot of his family that had held for a couple of generations, which they had sold off originally. It was about $500,000. And when they compared that to the context that we had built together, the values and vision that they wanted in life, they realized that they would be working somewhere in the order of 80 hours a week to facilitate this debt for an emotional and sentimental connection. And when we did that and we walked back out from that decision, they had this wonderful thing to say. They said, it's like you've inoculated me against my own personal bias. And I'm no longer swayed by every little thing that I think's a great idea, because I'm looking at it in a bigger viewpoint. I want to see if it makes sense for me, not today, not tomorrow, but a year and 5 years. And so they then completely changed their incredible grass-fed and finish beef business, their fermented feed pig business. You know, this gentleman, Dakota Cohen of Cohen Family Farms, just does amazing food. And once we get the internals figured out, everything else works down the road.
Yeah, I love that. Everything else works down the road. You brought up so many great points there, Javan, and I know I'm aware of your time because I know you have to leave. I don't know if the viewers, listeners know we started this call at 6:30 a.m. Javan's time, and he has to head out in a little bit. And you brought up some really deep stuff there that I really wanted to touch base on, but also wanted to kind of help you close out here. I think you brought that full picture in a good way, so I don't want to help you expound too much on there. I think that was well done. And so I guess two things. You mentioned you had like maybe one or two, or maybe I think you actually mentioned you might have 2 to 3 gifts you want to like share to the listeners and the viewers here, and didn't know if
Yeah.
you want to expound on those a little bit.
Yeah, for sure. They're called tools of sovereignty. They're processes and collections of things that I've picked up along the way. And so the first and foremost is a practice that comes from voice dialogue, Hal and Sidra Stone. And it's something that I want to pass along as an idea and an invitation to play with for the next week when you hear this. So from this point onwards for 7 days, when you have a big emotional reaction, positive or negative, doesn't matter. When you have a big emotional reaction, consider for a moment and go, interesting. Start to train your response instead of always giving into your reaction. So start off with the base level of this, and there's 4 levels. There's interesting, fascinating, good, and great. Start with interesting. Start to create a pause button instead of always reacting on maybe all things or some things. I think when I tell this and share this with folks who already work with interpersonal work, they're like, "Oh, I do that." And I said, "Do you do that in all your life?" And they go, "No." So, fair enough. Wherever you're at is wherever you're at. But start to train a response instead of a reaction. And the response that I like training people in is interesting because it brings curiosity up. And once there's curiosity, it's really hard to stay in that emotional reaction. Like, interesting. Why do I feel the way I feel? And this is a lesson from ecology. Once we have and are in a state of observation of what's this about? What's going on here? Then all of a sudden we can step back from, oh, I know what's happening. And I think it's Tom Brown who says the human mind is the loudest thing in the forest, and it sounds like a trash can going down a back suburban alleyway at 4 a.m. in the morning. And this is one of those amazing tools that can help inoculate you against that chatter of like, oh, I get it, I understand. It's just interesting. And it kind of puts us back at being 3 feet tall, like a little kid going, what's happening here? What's going on? And once we start to develop that interesting, so that's the first tool of sovereignty I want to pass on. And if you want, you can graduate to fascinating. I'm a big Star Trek fan, and Spock's eyebrow raise, and that fascinating is always like that is the pinnacle of curiosity in my mind. And then we go to good. I'm glad this happened. And great. What can I do with it? Because everything in life is inherently neutral, and it's up to us to give our perspective to it, to give it some weight. You ever see a kid bounce off the concrete and look to you being like, good or bad? Same thing with us. All of our kids inside of us for all of our lives, something happens and they're like, good or bad? We're pretty sure it's bad. So we have to then hold that space to be like, it's fine. It's just a thing that happened. And it takes time to build, but I can tell you after 5 years of doing that, I was in a major car accident a year and a half ago. And as I was getting out of the crumpled car and dumping the glass out of my boot, I said, why is this good? And I was surprised at myself. I was like, okay, well, it's working. So that's first and foremost. Interesting, fascinating, good, and great. Start to train your response. Second, when you then have that paused moment, consider and label, instead of saying, I'm angry, say a part of me. A part of me is frustrated. A part of me just yelled at that person who cut me off, thinking of myself a couple of days ago. A part of me is really excited to speak with Ben tomorrow morning. And that then gives you the ability to then cycle back. And all these tools, they work together in this sort of looping fashion. Interesting. I got really frustrated at that guy as I was pulling out of the grocery store. A part of me got really angry. What's that part about? And why does it do the things it does? And that conversation in terms of moving forward can be an exceptional way to create a lot of space in one's life and a lot of awareness in one's life. The last tool I want to pass on is one that I've used for a very long time, and it came to me from Byron Katie. And it was this idea that I only suffer when I argue with reality, but only 100% of the time. We are where we are. We're at where we're at. And when we say we don't want to be here, we're actively not only fighting the fight in front of us, but we're also fighting now this idea of, I don't want this to be true. And that idea can create so many heartaches and so many hardships. And so this idea of I only argue with reality, but only 100% of the time can really bring up this idea of what am I arguing against? And what part of me is arguing? They all work in synergy together. So I'd pass along those 3 tools of sovereignty because I've seen them have the most amount of value for the clients I work with. And I've seen them produce a lot of results in under a week's time.
Yeah, and those tools of sovereignty, it's ancient wisdom in those tools of sovereignty. I use a similar process I call the sacred questions. And and we can expound on that another time, it looks like. But I love how I just want to recap everything you said, because you're using these tools of sovereignty in your holistic life design with land design, urban design. Like it's just, and regenerative, we can just encompass that in regenerative design meets permaculture meets land design meets Javan. It's just so fascinating what you're doing, Javan, and I hope the listeners and the viewers who are on this call are really resonating with your work, and will reach out and actually practice that tools of sovereignty. Like you said, like, do you practice this every day? And be like, no, but I did it the other day. And like, you asked what day that was. Like, I see this in coaching all the time. Like, like, it's kind of like, have you been doing your homework? And the first questions, like, as your student will be like, no, like that can kind of be misguiding. But yeah, I just love what you're doing. And I just really hope our listeners and viewers will reach out to you and practice this process with you, and just keep changing the world of what you're doing. I really appreciate you coming on the call today.
No, thanks, Ben. It's been amazing to watch your growth, and it's been amazing to watch what you're doing with the FireKeepers Summit. Thanks so much for the work you do, and thanks so much for being in the world. And as I end here, if folks are interested in learning more about me, you can go to allpointsdesign.ca, or if you want to fast track to the life portion of the website, you can go to allpointslife.com. And to everybody who's listening, anybody who's watching, we all have ability. We all have a great love and a great connection with inside of us. And at the end of the day, we're all just walking each other home. So thank you so much for the work you're doing. Thanks so much for the work you will do with the ideas you have today, or the ideas you've taken from the summit. We're at a time in human history when we need everybody fully engaged and fully aware. It's an all hands on deck situation, if it was ever a time to be in that way. And it's just a pleasure to be connected with folks such as yourselves, because if you took the time to watch this or watch any of the summit, you have a bit of awareness, you have a bit of compassion. And I want to say, nurture that and let that grow. And it'll be great to work with you in whatever capacity, because we need folks doing the work.
Exactly. And can't top what you just said there. Thanks for closing us out, and just have a great day, Javan. Really appreciate it. Thank you.
Thanks, Ben.